the thing that's kind of been burning my mind lately is talking about disciplining children, because there's all this new evidence, and obviously there's this trend against spanking children. And my husband and I had to make this decision for our child. Like, are we going to spank it? Aren't we not going to spank? So of course, I went and looked at the literature. I'm like, well, what does the literature say about whether this is a benefit or not? And I have to tell you, like, I understand why parents want to spank their children. Like, I think if a day goes by that I think to myself, this problem could be solved with a spanking. If only I could spank her for this right now, like, this problem would be solved. I would not get this anymore. Even to the point where, like, people who do things that we consider, abuse of children, you kind of get it. You get it because they make you so angry. And I get parents who come in and want to talk about that, and want to talk about, like, there's this trend against spanking. What should I do? And the truth is that there has been a fair amount of evidence, a fair amount of studies on this that shows that it actually doesn't benefit in the long run. I mean, it shuts them up right now, which is probably beneficial for their immediate survival sometimes, because they drive us nuts. I mean, mine certainly drives us nuts, and they're insistent, and they won't shut up, and they argue. And I remember, my mom's like smacking us for that, and it shut us up. It did. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, I got spanked and I turned out just fine. Look at me. I'm like, well, first of all, you're presuming you turned out just fine, which is, up for debate. But secondly, overall, when we look at the evidence that kids who aren't spanked actually tend to do better socially, academically, professionally, in the long term, right? They tend to be not happier, because I think searching for happiness, for your children is crazy, right? We're not going to be happy all the time, but contentment is certainly important, and certainly the ability to function as adults and have a job. The evidence is pretty good that spanking certainly does not help any of that. And there's also not as good evidence, but decent evidence that shows that it's actually causes a negative impact. One of the things that it does is it causes a distrust of the parent and a fear for safety, which of course children look to their parents for safety. So trying to get people to walk away from spanking as a disciplinary technique is really about thinking about what kind of relationship do you want to have with your child. And do you want it to be a relationship where you're the disciplinarian, you tell them everything, and they just do it? Or do you want it to be a relationship where they ultimately figure out for themselves what they should and should not do? Do they develop a conscience? Do they develop the ability to make decisions on their own? And do they turn to you as a parent as more of an advisor? And a lot of parents of teenage kids say, why won't they talk to me? Why won't they tell me what their problems are? Well, because when they were little, you essentially told them what to do, and if they argued with you about it, you spanked them, right? Which did solve that immediate problem. I will completely admit it. But in the long run, you are not going to be in that role for your child forever. So really, the decision to refrain from physical discipline of your child, which lawfully today really just amounts to spanking with an open hand, is as close as you can come. Otherwise, pretty much everything else is considered abuse. The decision to use that really comes down to, what do I want the long-term outcome to be for my child? And that, honestly, that accounts for just about anything you do. Now, the important thing to consider is that no matter what we do as parents, our kids are probably going to be just fine. As long as we're not torturing them for no good reason, right? Like, the kids are probably going to be all right. One of the things we need to think about, I certainly think about this in terms of my parents, is are you doing the best you can, right? I think a lot of us get overwrought about how we're parenting, right? We have to have the perfect parties. We have to have the perfect clothes for our kids. They have to be in the perfect school. We have to live in the perfect neighborhood. And not everybody can do all that. I have some friends who are actually two moms, and everything in their house is perfect. They get all the perfect lessons. Their party layouts are perfect, and it's one mom and a dad, and I work full time, and dad doesn't care. So I don't have time for that, and I've really come to accept that my daughter's going to be okay without all of that. And I think that's true for most of us, really. Like, our kids are going to be fine as long as we don't take our anger out on them, right? Our own personal anger. And then, really ultimately looking back at our own childhoods, because many people struggle with trauma, really looking back on our own childhood, I think what really helps a lot of people to cope with their current environment is the realization that our parents actually did the best they could. Sometimes that's extremely depressing to recognize that they genuinely did the best they could, because that bar is clearly very low for many of us. But it is the truth, right? Nobody sets into parenthood with the idea of making their children's lives miserable. Nobody sets into parenthood with the idea of, I'm going to create these traumatic events for my children. So ultimately, as parents, I think our job is really to do the best we can and just make that better. Whatever it is, wherever you start out, just make it better. Really, love your kids, talk to your kids, try to be an advisor. I'm not saying let your kids do whatever you want, because that's super annoying to me when your kids do that. But it is important to help them learn how to behave themselves without any kind of really teaching them that violence is going to be the answer to behavioral problems, because that's what they're going to do in their lives. One way or another, they're going to be violent. So my advice to parents generally is, I wouldn't spank if I were you. Like, the evidence is against it. Discipline needs to be loving and appropriate and gentle.